Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a brand new episode of the Word of the Day podcast. My name is Jamie Silva. I am your host, and finally, at long last, after a lamentably long hiatus, we have returned. Speaking for myself, for producer Pete, and for the entirety of the Word of the Day staff here, many of whom had to look for other sources of unpaid employment while they waited for the show to start up again, I can confidently say we are all as pleased as punch to be back here in the RAV4 studios once again, where our tradition and occupation is pleasantly explaining useful words to you all. However, what you're about to hear is a very special edition of this podcast, where, for the first time, instead of pleasantly explaining a useful word, we're going to dedicate the entire show to a segment that's been, about 2.5 years in the making, which mainly speaks to our struggles with time management and show execution, but still, it was no small undertaking. I can't wait to get started, and since I'm in charge around here, I don't have to wait. So, let's hop right in. Today's episode is about the saying, "You can't have your cake and eat it too." This is a close cousin of other popular sayings, like "you can't have it both ways" and "getting the best of both worlds," which is sort of the inverse, like in this scenario, you actually can have it all. The basic idea with "you can't have your cake and eat it too" is that life is full of trade-offs, right? You have to make choices between different things, different ways of spending your time, money, attention, etc. And often, you encounter some very stark choices. Situations where you can either have this thing or you can have that one, but definitely not both. For example, if you and your friend Brad are at a baseball game, and Brad is hungry and wants to go grab a couple of hot dogs from the amazing hot dog stand down the left field line, but also he doesn't want to miss a minute of the action, you'd probably say, "Look, man, we can go get some hot dogs if you want, but if we did, we'd miss like an inning and a half of the game. You can't have your cake and eat it too, Brad." Now, this saying doesn't have to be about just physical stuff, like food or objects or whatever. It could also be about something more abstract. Like, what if Zeke wants to be a world-class jiu-jitsu fighter, but also he shudders at the very thought of suffering a sprained ankle or even a rug burn? Since it is very unlikely that Zeke can experience the thrills of international jiu-jitsu competition without sustaining even the occasional minor injury, then it's fair to say that he can't have his cake and eat it too. This example hints at another sense of the phrase that I feel is especially common. And this sense says, look, you've already got this really good thing, and now you want to avoid the small and relatively inconsequential downsides that necessarily come with that good thing? Don't be silly. Let's say, for example, that I live in a beautiful house right on the beach. But also, if there's one thing I just can't stand, it's sand, anywhere in my house, or on my front walk for that matter. Here, people might say, you can't have everything be totally perfect in every respect. How about you just vacuum a bit more often maybe, enjoy your beach house, and stop trying to have your cake and eat it too. Now, when I came across this phrase, I remember thinking, in one way, it makes sense. I see what it's trying to say. But looked at another way, it makes no sense at all. Like, what's the point in having a cake if you can't eat it? And really, everyone who ultimately eats any cake starts out by having that cake, by possessing it. Unless, I guess, they stole the cake off of somebody else's plate. But we're not talking about that rare situation right here. So, what gives? What gives is this. Originally, long ago, this saying was sort of reversed. It went, you can't eat your cake and have it too. This seems to fix the problem, right? Like, once you've eaten the cake, you can't still have it because it's gone. The reason this reversal works, and the version of the saying we all say today sounds kind of weird, is that we logically presume that whatever is mentioned first in a sentence must happen first, unless the sentence expressly says otherwise. So if you want to start saying, you can't eat your cake and have it too, and when people try to correct you, loudly insist that you're actually saying it right, and they're the ignorant ones. I'm not saying this would make you more popular as a person, but you would definitely have a leg to stand on. Now, this show rarely touches on current events, but we cannot resist commenting on how this phrase has gotten caught up in the whole Brexit debate, which has to do with the UK's ongoing departure from the European Union, or EU. Without getting into all the details, because yawn, Basically, many pro-Brexit Brits want the UK to have more control over things like regulation and immigration policy, rather than ceding that control or sharing it with the EU. And this was actually a big reason why they voted to leave the EU in 2016. But also, a sizable majority of UK citizens want to keep relatively free and open trade with the EU even after they've left and they're outside the Union. Summing up this position, one prominent British politician was quoted as saying that his policy on cake was pro-having it and pro-eating it. Which is to say, he wants the UK to have the benefits of being out of the EU, i.e. more control over immigration and other domestic policy matters, plus the benefits of being in the EU, i.e. open trade with Europe. In response to this, a top EU official said, and I'm going to quote here ever so slightly paraphrased, "The cake philosophy, that one can have the EU cake and eat it too, is pure illusion. To all who believe in this philosophy, I propose a simple experiment. Buy a cake, eat it, and see if it is still there on the plate. The brutal truth is that Brexit will be a loss for all of us. There will be no cakes on the table for anyone. There will only be salt and vinegar." Unquote. Once again, that is a real quotation from a real and very important European official who appears exceptionally willing to take imagery and just run with it. And by the way, there was a diplomatic meeting of some kind at which this same EU official went so far as to offer the UK Prime Minister Theresa May a tray of little cakes. And then he had someone take a picture of that moment and posted it on his Instagram with the rather annoying caption, "A piece of cake, perhaps? Sorry, no cherries." With the implication being that the UK cannot simply cherry-pick the portions of EU membership that it likes and leave out the rest. Anyway, so as I record, these negotiations are still ongoing, and to this day, those who argue that the UK can maintain certain rights and privileges of EU membership even after the country has exited are routinely accused of cakeism. I don't think this word is exactly taking off yet, but I love it as a concept. And if you want a handy label for someone who wants to have it both ways or have the best of both worlds, I think calling them a cakeist or saying they're succumbing to the delusion of cakeism would be completely appropriate. Now, back to the main thread here. One of the coolest things about this saying, "You can't have your cake and eat it too," is that dozens of languages and cultures have their own versions of it. Which is probably the case for a lot of sayings, but for this one, I found a ton of variations for it gathered together in one handy list on the internet. And lots of them were just so charming and fun that I wanted to share them with you. And to help me do so, I asked a whole bevy of multilingual friends of mine, plus the occasional friend of a friend, to read these variations. We didn't cover every single one, because I don't know anyone who speaks Icelandic, for example, but we got a nice bunch of them. And so, without further ado, here they are, starting off with Polish.
Hi, this is Paweł. Zjeść ciastko i mieć ciastko, or to eat the cookie and have the cookie.
Okay, pretty similar to the English here. A cookie is just a small and somewhat chewier cake, I guess. The next one is also about food.
Hi, this is Sophia. In Russian, the saying is "Rybku z'yist i vodu не лезть." In English, this translates to wanting to eat the fish without getting into the water.
This is, of course, basically the only way anyone eats fish nowadays, as you don't have to grab your fishing pole, bait, and tackle and find a body of water every time you want some, fish sticks for dinner. And as long as you're able to, reel the fish all the way into the shore or dock or boat or whatever, you don't actually have to get into the water even if you are fishing. But I'm distracting from the point of the saying, I guess. If you are fishing in a very old-fashioned way, possibly with your hands or a net because you can't afford a pole, or you have to wade out into the water a ways in order to cast your fishing line into the best spots, then sure, if you want any fish, you're going to have to get in the water at some point. The Bengali version sounds similar to this, but actually means something very different. Let's listen first.
Hi, this is Rifat. In Bengali, the saying goes, "Dhori mach na ছুঁই পানি," which translates, catching a fish without touching water.
Now, Rifat tells me that the point here is not that you can't eat the fish without getting wet. Rather, it's that some people out there are so clever, enterprising, or possibly sneaky that they can get away with things like this. So, by way of example, you might say Daniel seldom spoke up first in class, but he had a knack for echoing and paraphrasing the answers of others who had just spoken. This allowed him to seem very prepared and engaged, despite hardly ever doing the assigned reading. Here, Daniel gets all the benefits of being a good student without doing any of the work. So one could say, I guess, that he's eating fish without getting wet. There are a couple other versions of the saying that are like this, actually, where instead of emphasizing what you can't have or the difficult choices you have to make, they say you actually can have multiple seemingly conflicting things at once. Here's another of these.
This is Tanay. The phrase in Hindi is, Dono hathon mein laddu hona. A laddu is a small spherical sweet that you can usually hold in one hand. So the meaning of the phrase is to be able to hold a laddu in each of your two hands, which is a pretty good situation to be in.
Right, so in this scenario, most people would be content with, or would only be able to get their hands on, one laddu. But some lucky ducks out there just seem to get whatever they want. Next, we have the Chinese version, as read by Jeff. This one returns us back to the fish theme, and to the idea that life is full of trade-offs.
The phrase in Chinese is 鱼与熊掌不可兼得, which in English translates to, you can't have both the fish and the bear's paw, which, by the way, was considered a delicacy in ancient China.
Okay, so this one is a little harder to decipher, and in order to understand what it means, you sort of have to know where it comes from. And this would be an ancient Confucian philosopher named, I think it's pronounced Mencius, who lived in the 4th century BC. Mencius is credited with the following proverb, quote, I like fish, and I also like bear's paws. If I cannot have the two together, I will let the fish go and take the bear's paws. So, I like life, and I also like righteousness. If I cannot keep the two together, I will let life go and choose righteousness. Unquote. So it turns out that the fish and the bear's paw are metaphors, standing in for the concepts of life and righteousness respectively, with the latter, righteousness, I guess being the delicacy, the bear's paw. And while these things aren't necessarily in conflict, as is the case with both eating and having a cake/cookie, and eating a fish without getting in the water, the point is that if they are, righteousness ought to be preferable to life itself. This metaphorical meaning explains the following headline in the Telegraph newspaper that I saw while researching this saying. Quote, Xi Jinping, who is the president of China, Xi Jinping's new book of wisdom. You can't have fish and bear paw at the same time. Unquote. And then from the article itself, which was published in January 2015, quote, on Monday, Chinese state media celebrated the launch of President Xi's most recent book, at least his 8th since late 2013. English language reports omitted its distinctly dreary title, a compilation of Xi Jinping's remarks about party discipline, clean governance, and the anti-corruption campaign. The collection contains 216 of the president's, quote, select remarks, and is designed to boost Beijing's continuing struggle against corruption, unquote. Given the proverb's choose righteousness over life message, I get why they wanted to include it in an anti-corruption, quote-unquote, book. But considering corruption convictions can carry the death penalty in China, the subtext seems to be choose righteousness or you may not be alive for long. Which sort of distorts the meaning of the original saying, but hey, this isn't our compilation of remarks about party discipline and clean governance, so we'll just have to accept it and move on to the next version of this saying.
My name is Jessica. In Vietnamese, the saying is "Được cái này, mất cái kia." You gain one thing and you lose another. This saying is really commonly used in my family when I was growing up. It's usually used in the context of when my mom goes to the store. She'd come back from the market and she'll say, I bought fish at buy one, get one free. The quality isn't so great, but what can you say? Được cái này, mất cái kia. And we'd have mediocre fish for dinner.
Very good. So I like the example Jessica gives, because there is perhaps no place where the concept of trade-offs is easier to see than at the store, or in commerce more generally. You always want to buy the best and spend little, but you probably can't do both. You get what you pay for, as the saying goes, and there's a reason the word cheap means both inexpensive and shoddily made, or low quality. Also, if you're keeping track, that is 4 different versions of this saying thus far that have involved fish in some fashion. The next one isn't about fish, but it is still about commerce.
Bonjour, this is Della. In French, the phrase is vouloir le bœuf est l'argent du bœuf, which translated to English is to want the butter and the money from selling the butter.
You'll notice that this one looks at things from the seller's perspective. Just as buyers would ideally like to get great stuff without paying for it, sellers would ideally want the payment without giving up any stuff. They both face the same quandary. Neither can get exactly what they want, and the result of that endless tug-of-war between buyer and seller is the actual price of basically every good or service ever purchased. It's the great dance of the marketplace, or something. Anyway, the Serbian version contains a very similar idea, so let's listen to that one.
Hi, my name is Nina, and in Serbian we have a saying, ne možeš da imaš I jare I pare, which translates to, you can't have both the goat and the money.
Yep, so presumably you can either keep the goat or sell it for money, but not both. Next up, we have Greek.
Hey guys, this is Darius. In Greek, the saying goes like this, ketin pita alokliri, keton skilo hortato. The approximate English translation of this would be, you can't have the entire pie and the dog full.
Okay, two interesting things appear to be going on here. First, your dog eats pie, which is plausible, I suppose, as there are lots of savory pies out there too, such as pot pies. But the second thing is that you are apparently sharing your meal of pie with your dog. And unless he gets some too, he'll go hungry. Or at least he won't be full. Like maybe he's already had his kibble, but was hoping for a little something from your plate as well to top it off. I think your decision in this circumstance really reveals whether you're a dog lover or not. Okay, next up we have Korean, as read by Maria.
두 마리 토끼를 잡을 수 없다. You can't catch two rabbits at the same time.
Well, there is no question about that. See, when pursued, rabbits don't typically stick together in a herd, like maybe buffalo or schools of fish. Instead, they scatter, heading straight for the nearest, I guess, rabbit hole or burrow. Therefore, if you want to have any hope of catching one, you gotta pick a single rabbit and just chase that one. I suspect, sadly, that this saying does not refer to those times when all your pet rabbits get loose at once. Rather, it likely refers to hunting rabbits for food. The Japanese and Russian languages have equivalent versions of this, by the way, and all three basically mean instead of trying to do lots of things at once, it's best to pick one and focus on that. Which is sort of a narrower meaning than you can't have your cake and eat it too, but close enough. Okay, next we have Larissa on the German.
In German, the expression is, man kann nicht auf zwei Hochzeiten tanzen, which in English roughly translates to, one cannot dance at two weddings at the same time.
This one also speaks to the fact that you shouldn't, or literally can't, spend your time doing two things at once, or you can't be in two places at once. Sensible enough. Okay, what's next?
I'm Stephen Rowe, and here are two Spanish versions of the saying. A regional Mexican expression is, no se puede silbar y comer pinole, which means you can't whistle and eat corn flour. Another version in Spanish is, no se puede estar en misa y repicando, which means you can't be at mass and ringing the church bells.
Okay, the first one here sounds like a classic kids' party game that I remember playing once long ago, only with saltines instead of corn flour. I don't even know how you would eat just straight corn flour. The second one really draws on Mexico's Catholic heritage, and it makes sense. Though unless the bells are ringing for literally the entirety of Mass, then you can probably ring them for just like a little bit and still catch most of the service. Okay, moving on. What you're going to hear next is Persian, also known as Farsi, as read by Mehran.
Ham kharo mikhai ham khorma.
And that translates to wanting both God and the dates. And to be clear, dates refers here to the fruit, not the romantic outing. According to Mehran, this saying refers to the practice in certain ancient Arabic religions of having little statues of various deities around your house. These statues would be made of a mixture of dates and flour, which meant they were technically edible. So, if there was a famine, the household would be faced with the very difficult choice of going hungry or consuming these little statues of their gods. In this troubling situation, therefore, effectively, you could not have both God and the dates. Up next, we have Czech, read by Mary.
So the Czech version of you can't have your cake and eat it too is nejde sedět zadkem na dvou židlích. Give or take a little pronunciation variation there. But the literal translation of that is you can't seat your bottom on two chairs. which I think is extremely apropos because it is the most gritty, practical metaphor for something flowery, like you can't have a cake and eat it, which is so Czech, like so Czech. And of course, when you hear an actual Czech saying this with dripping sarcasm and a wry smile, it is absolute perfection.
Excellent. And this is indeed an extremely practical and down-to-earth formulation of the saying. And having spent a good deal of time in the Czech Republic herself, I think Mary can speak from experience about how this captures the gritty honesty, or is it the honest grittiness, of the Czech spirit. And actually, there is another Serbian version that is very similar to the Czech, so let's squeeze that in here. Nina, once again, will do this one.
Ne možeš sedeti na dve stolice, which translates to you can't sit on two chairs.
And presumably, the not at the same time or not with the same behind part is implied in these. They remind me of the English idiom of sitting on the fence, or more commonly, just being on the fence about something. This refers to the quality of being indecisive or uncertain or torn about what to do or think. There's only one fence in this scenario, not two chairs, but still, there's this sense of being off balance and liable to fall if you don't make up your mind. Okay, let's see what's next.
Hi there, my name is Juana. In Romanian, there are two translations for the saying, you can't have your cake and eat it too. The first is, nu poți împăca și capra și varza. This means, you can't reconcile the goat and the cabbage. The second is, nu se poate și cu tigaia unsă și cu slănina în pod, which means, you can't have both the pan greased and the lard in the attic.
Ah, these ones are great. To clarify the first, I think the idea is that if you have a goat, it's inevitably going to get into your garden and eat your cabbages. So you got to go the agricultural route or the livestock route, not both. The second is pretty self-explanatory. If you use up all your lard by, I imagine, making delicious fried foods every day, then you won't have any left in your attic, which is the sort of cool, dry place where one would store one's lard reserves. The point is, again, that life is full of trade-offs. Before we get to the last clip that I have, I want to mention my favorite version of this saying that I didn't get a recording of, which is Tamil, a language that is spoken in parts of India, Sri Lanka, and Singapore. And it goes approximately, you can't both have the mustache and drink the soup. I guess because the mustache would get in the way if it was, really bushy, or at the very least, you might get some soup in it, which I'm sure is very annoying. Sticklers might point out that just because it's annoying doesn't mean it's impossible, but whatever. Excellent imagery, I say. Alrighty, on to the final version.
Hey, this is Robert, and in Portuguese the saying goes like this: Querer ter sol na ida e chuva no Nabal. The English translation of this would be wanting the sun to shine on the threshing floor while it rains on the turnip field.
Now, for those of you who aren't hip to old-timey farming techniques, threshing is the process of separating grains of wheat or rice or other grain from the stalks it grows on. Farmers used to do this by hand, by laying out the stalks on a large flat surface called the threshing floor, which would usually be outside. The farmers would then hit the stalks with an implement called a flail, which was basically a nunchuck, if you know what those are. And indeed, some scholars believe that these threshing flails were the origin of the Japanese militaristic art of nunchaku, the central weapon of which appears to be modeled after the flails that rice and soy farmers would use during the threshing process. Anyway, so if you're threshing out grain, you want the stalks to be as dry as possible, which means you really want maximum sunshine on your threshing floor. But if your turnips need rain and your threshing floor needs the sun, sorry, you can't have both, or at least not at the same time. And that's it. I can't confirm that all of these are still spoken today. In fact, a few of the contributors noted that they'd never heard of this version before, despite growing up in the relevant country and speaking the language. So take them with a grain of salt, I suppose. At any rate, a huge thank you to all of our helpful and highly educated contributors. Once again, in order, these are Pavel on Polish, Sophia with the Russian, Rifat with the Bengali, Tanay the Hindi, Jeff on Chinese, Jessica on Vietnamese, Della giving us the French, Nina the Serbian, Darius contributing the Greek, Maria the Korean, Larissa with the German, Maran with Persian, Stephen with Spanish, Mary with the Czech, Juana on Romanian, and Robert with the Portuguese. I couldn't have done it without you all, and speaking for the whole show, we are eternally grateful. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that will do it for us and for today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as we did putting it together, and if you did, consider rating and reviewing the show on iTunes or telling a friend about it, all the usual things. We'll be back soon enough with more useful words to pleasantly explain, but until then, this is Jamie Silva, your host, saying so long from the RAV4 studios. Have a great, and we'll see you next time.